pulling teeth.
Yeah, so speaking of pain, section 2.2 has been known to
Tiny bit
some
painful.
painful responses in the past. There is no doubt that this section is probably one of the most in-depth that we cover throughout the whole class. And I know it's weird to get that this early in the class, but it is kind of it's part of the basic building block process to get through this. And so definitely I would say in your studies, as we cruise toward the end of the class, 2.2 is going to be a section you're going to need to come back and take a look at again.
I think, Travis, it's because it's a lot of information that we do not know, like we don't do on a regular basis. And the little bit of information that we can relate, it's wrong. So then we're trying to retrain our brains to the little we know and learn a whole new concept, and it just gets completely confused in your head. So you need to stop and say, whatever I learned before, screw it, forget it. Let me start fresh, and then just open my mind to whatever, and trust, big one, and trust that Travis and Seth and I are going to guide you to the right path.
Yeah, I think that's a fair sort of synopsis. I mean, so this section is all about what we call an estate. Now, some of you are not familiar with this word at all. Those are the ones that are in better shape here.
Exactly.
Some of you have heard this word in other contexts, and it will be difficult for you to put a new meaning to this word.
And that's what I meant earlier by you have associated these words with something that is totally different than what we're talking about.
Right.
And just to kind of like lay another like little foundation is this is stuff that we actually do, but we just don't realize it's called this. And if we have some experience with it, it's probably, like Leslie said, not being associated correctly. But I think the most important thing when you're starting this is to realize that what Travis just said also is that an estate is all this boils down to, and then it just kind of branches out from there. It starts at estate and branches out.
That's exactly right. An estate is the legal fancy way of saying relationship. Except it's not a relationship between people. It's a relationship between a human and a piece of real property, a human and land. Land can be owned. Land can also be leased. Whether you own land or lease land, you have an estate in that land because you have a legal relationship to that land. Those of you who own your own home, you have an ownership estate. Your relationship to that piece of land is you are the owner of that piece of land.
So anytime you see the word estate, just put relationship next to it.
Yeah, that's a great, exactly. Just substitute an estate is a relationship. If you hear or see, what is Seth's estate in a property? What are we really asking? What is his what to that property?
His relationship.
What is his relationship to that property? And
it's complicated.
It's complicated. And so the question is going to become, does he have an ownership relationship? What's the type? So there's really two main categories of relationships here. And it's almost like, if you want to use an analogy, it's almost like romantic relationships. There are dating relationships and then there's marriage, right? There's two different types of romantic relationships. You're either dating or you're married, right? And the same is true here. These are both relationships. The difference is one is a relationship of ownership, vocabulary word, and not only vocabulary word, I would say flashcard word. Would you say that's true, Seth, Leslie? You think this is probably a flashcard word here, freehold?
it's going to come back to haunt you a lot.
Yep. So the word freehold is the word we use to describe a relationship of ownership. I have a freehold estate in my home. What does that mean? Put that in normal people terms.
I own it.
I own the property.
You own your home.
I own my home. I own it. It's mine. It belongs to me.
The way I see it is I am freely holding the deed on this property, which is mine. It is my
I
property.
like that.
There you go.
Because when you look at the non-freehold, which is something that means you don't own it, but you have a legal interest
And
on it.
actually, Leslie, you're not far off from the root of that word freehold. Not only are you freely holding the deed, you're free to let go of it.
Yes.
Aren't you, if you're the owner of the property, aren't you free to transfer ownership to someone else?
It's called the right of disposition, right?
Right? You have the
That's right.
freedom to hold or not hold that property because you own it. Whereas a non-freehold estate is somebody who doesn't have that choice. And they don't have that choice because they are not what?
The owner.
They're not the
The
owner.
owner.
They don't own it.
They do have a relationship to the property. They are leasing the property. They have rights in the property, but they are not the owner. So when you see non-freehold, that simply means somebody who's a tenant, somebody who's leasing.
Mhm.
Freehold means somebody who has ownership. Now, it would be real nice if those were the only two categories that we had to focus on.
Well, yes. We like to
Unfortunately,
complicate things a little bit if you haven't noticed. Just a tiny bit. We like to make things a little more difficult for you.
right. So it's more complex than that. Freehold estates. So when we're talking about freehold, are we talking about ownership or rentals?
Ownership.
Ownership.
And I want you to add that word freehold to this slide. I should have had that in there. Freehold estates come in a couple different varieties. They actually come in quite a few different varieties that we're about to talk about in a second, but two big categories. If I have ownership of a property, I can have the type of ownership that I can leave as an inheritance after my death. In other words, how would you leave something as an inheritance to someone? What's the preferred way to leave something as an inheritance?
Will it?
Put it in your will,
Yes.
right? Don't we also leave things as an inheritance even if we don't have a will? If somebody dies without a will, don't we generally?
Survivorship.
Test succession.
Heirs.
They have heirs, right? Exactly. So though that is what we call a fee type of ownership. A fee type of ownership is ownership that can be inherited. A non-fee type of ownership is ownership, and I know this sounds weird. A non-fee ownership is one where the current owner is prevented by law from leaving it as an inheritance for their heirs. They cannot will it to someone. It will not go to someone upon their death. It will not go to their heirs upon their death. It will not go to their will upon their death. They can sell it, but they can't will it. That's what non-fee means. Both of these can be sold, but one can be both sold or inherited. Which one can be both sold and left as an inheritance?
Fee.
Fee. Which one can only be sold but cannot be left as an inheritance?
Non-fee.
Non-fee. So if I said to you, Leslie owns a farm, but she's prevented from leaving it as an inheritance to her children, does she have a fee interest in that farm or does she have a non-fee interest?
Non-fee.
Non-fee. Which one do you think is more common when it comes to ownership? Fee or non-fee?
Fee.
Fee, by far. Be honest. How many of you had no idea there was a type of ownership that you could not leave as an inheritance? How many of you that just kind of surprises you to even find out there is such a thing, right? It's very
It
rare.
surprises me. I have a very hard time kind of connecting where the fee and non-fee come in, and I don't want to jump ahead because I know y'all touch on this, but what basically all of the ownership types of estates are fee except for one.
That's
But it's
exactly
basically
right.
just another descriptive word.
That's exactly right. There are lots of different types of fee ownerships and only one type of non-fee. And we're going to put names to these. But as soon as you see non-fee, what does that mean? It's ownership. It can be sold, but it can't be what?
Inherited.
Inherited.
Current owner. And we're always talking about the current owner. We're not talking about what the previous owner can do. We're not talking about what a future owner can do. We're talking about what the current owner can do. If someone has, and so Cherie, I can't give you an example yet because we're not deep enough. You just have to accept the reality. And I just gave you as close of an example as I could at this point. I said, Leslie owns a farm that she cannot leave as to her children as an inheritance. That literally her ownership is restricted in such a way that she cannot leave it as an inheritance. That is a non-fee type of ownership.
Would that be?
I lost
You're muted.
I
Would that
am
be
so
something that
sorry.
would
I
be
was doing
included?
a routine mute.
What was that,
No
Robbie?
problem. I was like, is that something that would have been established like in the pertinent to the or in the contract or what we were talking about earlier?
Not in a contract. Contracts are only
Deed.
promises. It would be established in what? The previous what?
The
Covenants.
deed.
Previous deed. Because the deeds are always going to be the legal documents that add these sort of restrictions. So
And describes ownership.
that's exactly right. So if Leslie has ownership of a farm that she is restricted from leaving as an inheritance, she cannot leave it as an inheritance. Who put that restriction on her ownership?
Previously.
A previous owner.
The previous owner, the one right before her, the one who granted her ownership said, you can't leave this as an inheritance. And folks, can they do that?
Do whatever they want.
Owner.
Absolutely, because they were the what at that point in time?
Owner.
They were
The
the
owner.
owner. At that point in time, they were the owner, and they transferred ownership to Leslie saying, you can't leave this as an inheritance. And here's the thing, folks, she had a choice. Nobody held her at gunpoint and said she had to take ownership. She took it that way. And if she took it that way, does she have to live with that restriction?
Yes.
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Is it too
Absolutely.
early to ask what happens to if she dies or something like that happens?
Well, it's not too early, but we can't answer that as a generic question because it's not a generic question. If the previous owner went to the point of saying she can't leave it as an inheritance, don't you think the previous owner probably also dictated what's going to happen to it after Leslie no longer is alive?
That would make sense.
Yep.
Right?
Can you give me an example of what kind of stipulations someone would put on their deed in that?
Anything. I mean, the previous owner could say, I want Leslie to own it. And when she dies, I want it to go to the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill as a donation.
Yeah, that's a restriction.
And guess what? Since that grantor said Leslie can own it, but when she dies, it goes to the University of North Carolina. What can Leslie not do? She can't leave it as what?
Inheritance.
Inheritance.
Can that be changed if I sell it or if they sell it?
No, because these restrictions are what?
Pertinent.
Pertinent. There's that word.
But so the reason for this would either be like some kind of philanthropy situation or just meanness.
The reason for this is a grantor who's an asshole. That's the reason for this. See, this is what you have to do when you're taking a class like this. You have to understand that just because something exists doesn't mean it's going to be common. But there are grantors who, for various reasons, want to transfer ownership with strings attached. And they can, because it's theirs, right? They can do that.
So Sharon asked a question, and I'm gonna, we're gonna talk about it later on, of course, but here's one of the things that I learned a long time ago. And this might help you answer the question, Sharon. Do not mix ownership with money.
Right.
Payment, loan, mortgage has nothing to do with the money part of
Right.
the
So the
ownership.
co-signing part you can delete out of that. It has nothing, because co-signing is something that deals with financing. So what you're asking is, if my mom purchases a home and she's an individual buyer, would I be eligible to inherit the property? As long as she has what word on her deed, Sharon?
The will. Is it
No.
What word? Look at the screen. What word?
E.
E. And you got to make the connection. Where is this found? What document do you go to?
D.
The
Go
deed.
to the deed. And if you want to know if your ownership in this property can be left as an inheritance, what word are you looking for on the deed?
B.
Fee. If you're looking for the word fee. And if you see non-fee, you can't leave it as an inheritance. But if you see fee, you can. That's really as simple as it is. What do you think? What word do you think shows up on the vast majority of all deeds?
B.
Fee.
I gotta look at my deed then.
You better go look. And Sharon better go look at her mama's deed. If she wants to know if she can inherit her mama's property, she better go look at her mama's deed. Right?
Travis, when you said that somebody had to be a butthole, I had literally just inboxed Seth, like the movie Mommy Dearest. It brings to my mind Mommy Dearest, because she had Christina and her son who were adopted, and she left them nothing at the end, but they were adopted, and on top of that, she was an ass. And so like I think of something in that case, something like that, someone that you don't want to have the property, you want to be a butthole about it.
Right.
So
yeah. And so Jessica asked, can you still sell a non-fee? You can. But here's the thing, folks. That restriction is what?
Pertinent.
Pertinent. So that person that just bought it is also not going to be able to leave it as a what?
Inheritance.
As an inheritance. Is that going to dramatically limit who would be interested in purchasing that property?
Yes.
Yes. See, you all have, and I don't mean this in an insulting way. You have a child's approach to real estate at this point in time. You keep expecting the fairy godmother to come out and say, oh, honey, we're going to make it all better for you. No. Whose job is it to figure out what they're buying before they take ownership?
Grantee.
The grantee. And a grantee who thinks they want to have the property be inheritable by their heirs should never buy one from a grantor whose deed has what phrase on it?
Non-fee.
Non-fee. Has everybody making that connection now? Right? Because if you see that
Mark said non-fee. Mark said non-fee equals asshole.
It does. It equals that some grantor along the way was an asshole. They
We'll write that down.
And listen, that's not the only way they can be one, but that's certainly one of the ways. Is that starting to click for everybody? Shay, did you have a question? Okay, good. Now, these are.
Flo has a question, Travis, before you scare us with this picture. I think Flo has a question.
What's up, Flo?
I was gonna say, I think the common way that I think about, and we haven't gotten it yet, so please don't slit my throat just yet. I know there are four other
promises.
There are 4 other components to the non-fee, like joint tenancy, tenancy in common, all those.
Those don't relate to fee or non-fee.
Oh, so I'm thinking less than freehold estate.
And less than freehold means leasehold. Freehold simply means ownership.
Okay, so that's a different category.
Probably not.
Those
talking
words,
something else.
joint tenancy, tenancy in common, tenancy by the entire, refer to the number of owners, not the type of ownership. We're talking about the type of ownership right now.
Okay, because I was gonna, if I said it right to begin with, I was gonna say another one would be, well, one of those branching examples of, you know, multiple people owning a property, then you can't inherit it because they are separate family members. They're not family members, they're separate.
But that deals with when you have more than one owner. Right now, we're focused on one owner. We're talking about singular ownership by one owner right now, and that's the type of ownership. So we're getting there, but it doesn't relate to fee or non-fee. Don't pollute that in your brain, okay? Okay. Now, this chart can be intimidating. But what I will tell you is we're going to try to make it not nearly as intimidating. First of all, we're going to take away one side of the chart right away.
Yep, easy peasy.
We're just going to get rid of the non-freehold stuff. Right now, we're going to focus only on what type of relationship that somebody has with a property.
The best way for you to figure this out, because again, when you look at it from the bigger picture, you're like, holy cow, what in the world is this? This is a foreign language to me. Just break it down one thing at a time and make sure you understand each part. It just keeps going to the left, keeps going to the left, and just break it down. We'll get to the big picture at the very end, but for now, just focus on the ownership type.
That's exactly right. We're simply going to focus on freehold, on the ownership. And so as we focus on ownership, what we're going to start to do is break these down. Look at the different types of ownership, because there are different types. Now, that doesn't mean the different types are common. There's really only one of these that's a very common type of ownership. Now, this does not refer to the number of owners. We're not talking about if a husband and wife own property together, if two best friends own property together. How many owners are we dealing with right now, folks?
One.
Just one. Solo ownership, okay? Because we're staying as simple as possible, and we're talking about the type of ownership. Also, Leslie mentioned something really important, and this is one of those things that Seth will constantly hammer to you throughout the class as well. We are not talking about financing. If you have a temptation in the next few days to ask a question about a loan, stifle it.
Stop it.
Censor yourself. We're not talking about loans. We're not talking about mortgages. We're not talking about payments to the bank. None of that matters when it comes to ownership. That is financing. That is borrowing money. That is an entirely different area than ownership. One of the most common mistakes that people make is they think because they're making payments to a bank on a note on their property that they don't yet own the property. Yes, you do.
Yep, you do.
If you have what four-letter document, you own the property.
Deed.
If you have a deed with your name on it as the grantor, as the grantee, excuse me, you are the owner of that property. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yeah.
Yep. So don't associate money, loan, mortgage, none of those things with ownership, because it will confuse you so bad in this section.
It will. It really will. And we're not focused on that. The thing about transferring ownership, you have two parties. You always have the transfer of ownership involving the exact same two parties. You have a grantor who is transferring ownership over to a grantee.
Mm-hmm.
Now, who is in control of that? Who is deciding the type of ownership that is going to be transferred?
Grantor.
Now, the grantee does have some control, but their decision is this: either accept what the grantor is giving you or don't accept what the grantor is giving you. Folks, if you don't accept a deed, are you the owner of the property? Even if they put your name as the grantee and they didn't try to hand you the deed and you won't take it, are you the owner or have you refused ownership?
Refused.
You have refused ownership. But if you take that deed that they just handed you and you take it down to the county courthouse and you make it public knowledge, you record that deed, Are you accepting whatever conditions that grantor placed
Yes.
on the deed?
Yes.
Yes.
You are. You absolutely are. And so the grantor is in a position of deciding how they want to transfer ownership, whether or not they want to limit in any way the transfer of ownership to this grantee. Now, here's a practical question for you, and it's okay if you don't really know the answer yet, but I want you to start thinking about these things in these terms. Do you think a grantor who is limiting, placing restrictions, not fully transferring ownership is going to the asshole? Do you think the asshole is going to have a harder time selling the property?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Do you think the asshole is going to get less money for the property?
Yes.
Yes. Do you think, depending on certain circumstances, they might not be able to sell it at all if they insist on certain restrictions?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. So in most sales, do you think the grantor is adding these restrictions, or do you think in most sales, the grantor is basically not placing any additional restrictions?
Not placing.
Not placing. Most grantors don't bother with this. The vast majority of grantors don't limit the transfer of ownership, but they can. Here's what they can do. They can limit. They can put brakes on. They can slow down. They can say, no, wait a minute, you can't do this with the property. Or wait a minute, well, it can't be inheritable. Or wait a minute, you can only own it for this long. The grantor can control all of that. But let me tell you what a grantor cannot do. Is everybody listening to me?
Yes.
No grantor can give the grantee more rights than the current grantor has. In other words, I can't take away restrictions that were already there before I owned the property. The best I can transfer is the property with no new restrictions attached to it. If there were already restrictions there, what was our favorite A word about those restrictions that were placed on a previous deed, even if it was 5 deeds?
Appurtenant.
They're appurtenant, and they last how long?
Forever.
That current grantor, if they took ownership with certain restrictions, all they can do is pass those restrictions along to the next grantee.
So they can leave it the same or make it worse, but they cannot make it better for the
There
new
you
owner.
go. Bingo. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Same or worse, but never better,
Never better, same or worse.
right? You're never going to get better ownership than the person before you of the property. So what are the two ways in which a grantor can sort of be a jerk about this thing? They can limit one of two things. They can limit time. Time is an interesting thing when you think about limiting it. Normally, if you think about most situations where you think of someone as the owner of a property, is their ownership limited by time, or are they pretty much able to own the property as long as they choose? Can they decide when they no longer own the property?
As long as
Yes.
they choose.
Yes, they own it as long as they choose to own it. They own it until they sell it, or they own it until they die, in which case, don't their wishes still get honored in most cases? Even after they're dead, don't they still control ownership of the property?
Yes, it is a
Yes, they have a will, they have heirs. Does that make sense for everybody? Right? That's the most common, but it doesn't have to work that way. That grantor could limit time. That grantor could transfer ownership to this grantee for a limited period of time.
which is making it worse than what they had before, remember?
It's downgrading. That's exactly right. The other thing that the grantor can limit, and they could limit both if they wanted to, but we look at them as either or type things in this class because we're looking at kind of the simplest examples. They could limit number one, time, or number two, use. A use limitation is a rule or a restriction that says the grantee can't do certain things with the property, or the grantee can only do certain things with the property. In other words, the grantee doesn't have the freedom to use the property in any way they want. They have to follow restrictions. So examples of this, how about that developer who comes along and puts 20 pages worth of covenants or rules against that property? On what legal document would that developer, when they transfer ownership to a buyer, place all those restrictions?
On the deed.
The deed.
On the deed. As a matter of fact, folks, we literally call them deed restrictions. That's one of the covenants are also called deed restrictions because that's where they go. They're restrictions that go on the deed. Here's the thing though.
Wow.
Is that developer restricting the use just for this grantee? Or is that developer now restricting the use of that land forevermore, no matter who owns it from now to the end of time?
Evermore.
Forever. No matter who owns it till the end of time, because those restrictions become what?
Permanent.
And here's what's interesting, folks. The next deed after that doesn't have to mention those restrictions. That's why when you go look, you can't look at one deed. How many deeds do you have to look at?
All of them.
All of them, because you have to find all the restrictions that have ever been placed against that property. Because the current owner is going to have to honor all of them. So grantors, when they place restrictions, can either limit time or they can limit use. So look at this question. If a grantor places limits on the property when they transfer it to the grantee, how long do those limitations apply to the property? Remember when we did the poll everywhere thing? You're going to go back into that text messaging.
Text messaging. Yep.
You should be able to just define that string. You shouldn't have to do the Travis Everett 302 anymore. You should be able to just answer A, B, C, or D. If it won't let you, you might need to do the Travis Everett 302. But remember, it's the text message string 22333 is the number.
All one word.
Yep. You shouldn't have to do the Travis Everett 302 again. You should be able to just answer A, B, C, or D. But
It's telling me I do need to send it in.
Okay, then send it in again. So if a grantor places limits on the property when they transfer it to the grantee, how long do those limitations apply? A grantor cannot limit anything about the property when they transfer it to a grantee. B, until the property is transferred to a future grantee. C, forever in most cases. Or D, I have no idea who a grantor is.
D for me. Please. D all the way.
Good. It looks like most of you are getting the point that these restrictions are going to stay there. And as we mentioned earlier, every single transfer is a new deed. Every single transfer has a new grantor and a new grantee. As a matter of fact, when you start to think about it, you can't find the deed to a property. You can find a deed to a property. Why can't you find
the deed? I mean,
why can't you find the deed?
Because
there might be multiple.
Because all of them
There's so
apply.
many. Not just one.
Not there might be multiple. There
There
will
will be.
be.
Yeah.
Unless you know somebody who's really, really old and they've owned that property for the last, I don't know, 10,000 years or so. There's going to be multiple on that property. Eddie, did you have a question? No, you're good. Okay. So when we say we're looking for the deed, we're really being incorrect. What we should say is that we're actually looking for the most recent deed on the property. That's the one we're looking for, because that's the one that's going to show us who most recently was transferred ownership of the property. How do we feel about that statement? Is that a statement that kind of resonates a little bit with you now? That when we look for the most recent deed, what we're actually looking at is the legal document that was last used to transfer ownership of this piece of land, and how there's going to be several of them for that same piece of property if you go further and further back in time.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
So it's safe to say that every time a piece of property, remember, we're not talking about a house, a building, we're talking about land, and land is old, very old. Anytime a piece of land has transfer ownership, we're going to find one of these. We're going to have one of these documents.
That is exactly right. And let me see if I can do this with a little bit of a visual here that might help. Let me share my screen with you a little bit differently here.
I have a quick question.
Okay, go for it.
So if I buy a piece of land and I don't have a house built on it, the deed is just, it's for the land, of course. But as soon as you build a house, do they amend that deed, or is it a whole nother deed to include the home?
We don't care about the home.
Whole nother deed, because it's a different transfer. And that's exactly what I'm about to show you with this. Let's say the most recent deed on the property is all the way back in 1975. Well, you're going to have a grantee and you're going to have a grantor listed on that deed. Does that make sense for everybody? Now, who is transferring ownership to who? Isn't it going from grantor to grantee?
Yes.
Yes.
On that deed?
Yes.
So if we look at, this is the most recently recorded deed, who do we consider to be the current owner of the property?
The grantee.
Grantor.
The grantee.
Oh, most recent. I am so sorry, grantee.
Grantee. But here's the thing, that's not going to be the only deed we see on that property. Same property, there's another deed from 1967. Here's the connection that you may not have made yet that I need you to make. Folks, this grantee on this deed is going to be who on the deed after it?
The grantor.
Grantor.
The grantor on the next deed. And if we went further back in time and we found a deed from 1952, there would still be a grantor and a grantee, except the grantee from this deed better be the grantor on the next deed. Does that make sense for everybody?
Sure.
Yes.
Because ultimately what we have to be able to do is see, and I'm going to try to draw with one color to connect them all. We have to be able to see this clear transfer of ownership unbroken between all of these people. We have to be able to see that ownership has clearly transferred from beginning to end and is unbroken. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Travis, did I hear you right? And you said that the restrictions, like back in 1952, you do not have to record them on the new deed and does not have to be recorded on the deeds thereafter. That's why you have to look at all of them. Is that what you said?
That is exactly right. But we call this the chain of title, by the way. And so here was Mark's question. What if we've got restrictions back here on this deed in 1952? Do the people who own the property now here in 2022 have to follow those same restrictions, even though they weren't mentioned on the two most recent deeds?
Yes.
Yes.
They do, because any restriction ever placed on a deed on that property is good for how long?
Forever.
Forever. Is that starting to click into place for everybody?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. And so what you really start to see is that you're really looking for a history of the transfer of ownership of these properties. And so when you look at, and this is an example of a deed, and there are going to be some things you can already start to recognize on here. You're going to be shocked at how much you already know by looking at, some of these documents, I think, because I just dropped my pen. Hang on just a second. Because it's amazing how much you start to be able to pull this information together when looking at a deed. Now, if you look at this deed, first of all, look up there in well, you can look at a couple different places, but when was this deed written?
13th of
May
May.
13, 2009.
Yep.
2009.
Everybody see that? 5/13/2009.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. And it shows you here that the grantor, it was actually two people, Sandra and Vincent Mistison. Apparently Sandra used to rob banks for a living because she's got an alias on hers as well. She was formal, and actually we're going to talk about that in just a minute. She was formerly known as Sandra Bolden, and her husband, Vincent Mistison, are the grantee or grantors. Who's the grantees here?
Andrew,
Peter, Sean,
Travis.
And Travis.
Travis Everett.
Andrew and Travis, right? Andrew and Travis are taking ownership of this property as of the 13th of May, 2009. Does that make sense for everybody?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Now, that legally transfers ownership between these parties. And if you will notice, there are no restrictions mentioned here on this deed. Does that mean there are no restrictions at all against the property, or does that simply mean that this grantor chose not to place any restrictions?
There may be
Not
more.
this
Not
grantor.
to add any more.
It means that this grantor chose not to add any more. Okay. Somebody sent me a private question to say, can we explain the difference between a deed and title? Well, a deed is a legal document.
Good question.
It's a piece of paper that you can touch and feel. Title is an idea.
The bundle of rights.
I'll
Actually,
I'll give you an analogy that I like for it. What's the difference between love and a marriage license?
One's
Marriage
legal, one's
license-
not.
A marriage license is what?
A piece of paper.
tangible.
It's a piece of paper. It's a legal document that serves a legal function. What is love?
Non-tangible.
An idea, a
It's
feeling.
an
I
idea.
guess.
You can't.
It's like a butterfly.
right? You cannot touch it. You cannot. You know what? Right? It's the idea. Title is the idea of ownership. A deed is the legal document that says this belongs to me. Does everybody see the difference there?
It's tangible.
Yes.
Yes.
Okay. So the document is the deed. Title is simply the idea of ownership. Here's the thing though. When Travis and Andrew took ownership of this property, do you think it was probably in their best interest to research further back in time and look at previous deeds to see if there are restrictions that need to be followed on that property?
Yes.
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 And let me change my share here for just a second. Do you think it's probably also a good idea for them to go and make sure that these grantors and grantees match up and you can follow that chain of ownership? And would it be a problem if there was a break in this chain somewhere along the way?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, because then we would have a question of
Where'd it go?
Where'd it go?
Ownership.
You know, who owns it? You know, if all of a sudden we're missing a person, that's not good. That's not good. They need to match up all the way through. So we got to go further back in time. And keep in mind, not just me. If I was selling this house, would the buyer right now, first of all, want to see our deed from 2009?
Yes.
Yes.
But should they go back further in time?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Yes. And if they do, here's what they're going to find. When's this deed written?
27th of August, 2007.
August 2007. So not much time between these two deeds, is there?
Mm-mm.
No.
2007 to 2009. Now, here's an interesting one. Look at this deed. Who's the grantor?
Scott Bolden.
Last name.
Just
Bolden.
Scott Bolden.
Scott.
And who's the grantee?
Sandra.
Bolden.
Sandra who?
Bolden.
Bolden. Now, I'm going to back up a deed. How do you see the necessity of identifying her as the artist formerly known as Sandra Bolden?
Yes.
See that necessity now?
Yes. Yes.
because we have to see that this person is the same as that person. Does that make sense for everybody? And by the way, what has she probably done in the 2 years between 2007 and 2009? She done got what?
Gotten married.
Married, because
Domesticated.
if she was already married to Vincent in 2007, wouldn't she be identified as Sandra Mistison here if she was already married?
Yep.
Yes.
How many of you knew you could be so damn nosy just by looking back at property records? So now here's my question for you. Scott Bolden and Sandra Bolden. And by the way, this deed's also interesting. Most deeds don't identify money. This one did. How much did Sandra pay?
$10.
Scott
$10.
$10.
property
That
located
was her dad or her brother, huh?
at $10. $10. She paid Scott $10 for this property. Man, Scott was a dodo head, wasn't he?
Quick claim deed, right?
Folks, I think we need to go further back in time to see what happened here. What do y'all think?
Yes.
Think we could go back in time further?
Yes, please. I'm interested now
Smells.
because I thought that was Sandra's dad.
Let's go back
Nah,
one more deed right here.
dots are X.
Here is
Somebody messed up.
2004. And here's what I want you to see about June of 2004. Look who the grantee.
Oh my God, I was right. I knew it.
And wife.
Tramps.
Either Scott or Sandra was messing around. One of them.
Who's the wife messing around?
I
can tell you who was messing around.
Oh, I
$10.
can tell you who was messing around.
It
Who?
doesn't take too long to figure that out. He bought the house for $10.
Because here's the thing, folks. In 2004, they were a happily married couple. By August of 2007, Scott is selling his interest in the property to Sandra for $10. What do y'all want to bet that this was not by choice, that this was probably the result of a judgment from a certain judge?
Lord.
It's called divorce decree.
For sure.
They only been there for 2 years and he gonna mess around.
Yeah, my guess is this was an eventful couple of years for Scott and Sandra. Now, keep in mind, in North Carolina, you got to be legally separated for at least a year. So he didn't waste no time in messing around from when they bought this house together, did he? You know? They bought it in June of 2004.
I'm gonna look him up.
It didn't like where he put the toothbrush.
And they were divorced in 2000, by August of 2007.
I have a question. That's what he didn't do.
It says a quit claim deed on the top of that one, and then the other one says a warranty deed.
Yep, we're going to talk about the difference between those a little bit later on, the different functions of them. But for right now, it's a good thing that you noticed it, but we're going to hold off on that for right now.
And I also wanted to mention that the name of that attorney was Savage.
The name of the attorney that was Savage. Nice. Nice. Okay. So does everybody see here that in June of 2004, Scott and Sandra were husband and wife? And by the way, Sandra ain't no slack here. Look, she bought a house with her husband, Scott, in 2004, got divorced in 2007. By 2009, she is selling that house and she's already what?
Married again.
Married again.
Tramp.
No time.
Hey, I respect it, girl. Do it.
They're just both messing around.
Who knew you could be so nosy just from
Y'all are so nosy.
Sandra's quick.
Y'all better leave Sandra alone, man.
Scott might not even be alive at this point.
Don't mess with
You
Sandra.
had to comfort her.
So if you look at the grantor here, you have this Alan and Bonnie Sue Brunner.
What does Beyonce say? If you like it, you should have put a ring on it.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And if we go even, and notice, still no restrictions. No restrictions. does that mean Travis and Drew own the property with no restrictions, or does that mean they just need to go further back in time?
They need to go
further
back in time.
They need to go further back in time, right? Here's one from back in, if you look at the date on this one, if this date was actually prepared in March of 2000, right there. It says 3/9/2000. Okay. And in this one, you notice Alan and Bonnie Sue are our grantees, which matches up with our grantors on the next deed. So no questions there, no shenanigans going on there. And they bought the property from a guy named Roland Booma. And there's some free advertisement for Roland, at least back in 2000, he was what?
Unmarried.
He was unmarried.
I bet Sandra knows him.
Sandra may have.
Drag Sandra through the mud.
And by the way, I included a little bit more here for you because I want you to see how much you've already learned. I want you to look at this right here. And I know it's small. It says unto the grantee in fee simple. What does that word fee mean?
Ownership.
Inheritable.
Inheritable, right? It means this was being transferred as an inheritable type of ownership. Does that make sense for everybody?
Wait, where do you see that?
I highlighted it in green.
In green.
Under the witnesseth.
Yeah. Unto the grantee in fee simple, right? So that means this was an inheritable type of transfer. And just give me a little bit more information on each one of these so you can start to see how the deed really does tell the story. And
Travis,
yes.
how much you want to bet that all of these people that own property are going to go look at their deed tonight and start doing some snooping around?
Well, not only theirs, but they're going to dig further and further and further. I actually encourage that because
it's going to get juicy. I just looked at mine.
I want to look into it.
See, y'all notice this up in the right-hand corner up here. Let me see if I can zoom in on it for you.
Yes, Jay, it means that they could be inherited, like meaning they could inherit to somebody else. It is inheritable, so they can give it to somebody, not that they inherited themselves.
So if you look up there in the right-hand corner, see that stamp that's up there? This means, this shows that this is a publicly recorded document. Could you still go find a copy of this document?
Yes.
Yeah. And Jay, for clarification, yes, it means it's inheritable, but not inherited. It just means that the grantees could leave it as an inheritance. By the way, if you want to visit Miss Riddick, she's in prison. You can go see her in prison anytime you want to. She embezzled something like $3 million from the Wake County Register of Deeds office, and she's still in jail.
Wow, that's awesome.
Yeah, she did.
Not worth it.
You can look her up. She
Travis,
big time.
I wanted to ask you a question. If we backed up to when they got, what was the wife's name that bought it for $10?
Sandra Bolden.
When they purchased it together, if they had made an arrangement saying that upon them being divorced, that neither of them could sell the house or have the house, would that be something
that's called a prenuptial agreement?
Gotcha.
and clearly they did not have one.
Right.
They weren't smart. They weren't
so
smart.
A judge in court could undo what's been done.
A judge can override a prenuptial agreement. They just don't very often do that.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Unless you've been married a long time.
And no, prenuptial agreements are definitely not listed on deeds because they don't need to be, because this happened as a result of a court order. If there had been a prenuptial agreement, as soon as the judge issued that order, Scott would have said, oh, no, wait a minute. I got an agreement right here where we signed saying we were going to split the house evenly. Yeah.
I do have a question too. If at this point, if that's what I was looking for to find out if it was an inheritable deed, at this point, I don't have to go any further, because if it was an appurtenance,
you have to look at every one of them, because each one would need to have the word fee on it. Each one, including the most recent one.
So that could have been changed along the way then?
No, because inheritable simply, just because you found the word fee doesn't mean somebody hasn't put the word non-fee after it, is what I'm saying. You have to look at all of them to make sure none of them say non-fee.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Alyssa had a question as well.
Yeah, so I just wanted to confirm, the one that has the word fee on it, that was stated just basically saying that along the line, this property could be given to somebody as an inheritance. It wasn't stating that the grantor in that case was giving it to.
Correct. That was Jay's question. They're simply saying that Alan and Bonnie Sue, who are the grantees here, have the legal right to leave this as an inheritance when they die.
And that stays with the property throughout up until to today.
So it does. And Shay, you asked a great question, but I'm gonna have to get on your case, Shay. It ain't about the house. 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 What's it about, folks?
The land.
The land.
The land.
The land was there long before the house was. Do you have to go back long before the structure existed?
Oh, yeah. Big time.
It's not about the structure. And if you go back far enough, and this is the furthest I went back.
I do have one more question though. Is that just here for North Carolina? Or is that everywhere?
Everywhere.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Because deeds relate to the land, not the structure. Here's the most recent one I have. And keep in mind, this is all same property. We're all looking at 114 Heininger Drive, which is the house I'm broadcasting from right here, right now. This is a deed recorded in 1989. And why did I go far enough back to show you this one? Well, I wanted to take you back a certain amount of time, but there's something on this deed that I really want to show you. And I have to go to page 2 of this deed to see it. And it's hard to see. I'm going to zoom it in. And if you see what, and hopefully you'll see why I mean you got to look at all of them. Look at page 2 of this deed that was recorded in 1989 on this property. What does it mention on that deed right there?
Restricted covenants.
Restrictive covenants. Does that mean this grantor, way back in 1989, was placing restrictions against this property?
Yep.
Yes.
It does. And even though you've got, 5 deeds on this same property since then, and none of them make mention of those restrictions, are those restrictions still valid and in force on this property?
Yes.
Yes, they
Forever.
are. And that's why you've got to go further back in time. That's why you've got to go back and look at. Now, when I say you, who do I mean? Grantor or grantee? Grantee. Now, Jay said, what are the covenants? If I wanted to know what they are, guess what I would do? I would ask that same Register of Deeds in Wake County, show me what? Book number what?
Number 2544.
2544, page 289. And you would
promise you they're there. I promise you.
And they're there because they're also public record.
Does she have that book with her in prison?
She probably does.
Looking at all the mistakes she made.
Somebody, by the way, somebody did send me a private message of how did Laura Riddick get caught? My question has always been, how did she not get caught? Because let me tell you what she was doing. Every time you record one of these documents, you have to pay. And the current fee is in Wake County is $26 per page to record these documents publicly. And folks, they don't take checks. They only take what? Cash. So there is tens of thousands of dollars every day flowing through that office. She insisted on personally rectifying the cash receipts on a daily basis. And she did that for 12, 13 years before finally somebody said, it's kind of weird that there's like 20 of us that work in here and the boss wants to count the cash every day. Why does she want to count the cash? Meanwhile, she was working a job that pays like $80,000 a year and living in like a $2 million house and had a house up on Lake Gaston.
Greed caught her.
Yeah, she'd be in jail.
Did you say $80,000 a year?
That's what something that the Register of Deeds pays like $80,000 or $90,000 a year, something like that.
She was
And
living in a I see why she was living in a $2 million house.
yes. So she was taking a lot of cash money.
Damn.
Took Seth a minute to put two and two together.
I was like, how did that work out?
Yep.
Just in case anybody was wondering, Meredith and I have found out that Sandra and Vincent are happily married still on Facebook, and they
Oh
do
my
look
God,
happy.
y'all are Facebook stalking.
Oh my God.
I said, I found her, but I can't find him. She said, oh, I found him in her friends list, FBI over here.
Oh my gosh, you're too funny. That's too funny.
There's always tomorrow, though.
And they have a baby.
So that
No privacy.
Well, there you go.
Y'all are horrible.
I bet they're not friends with Scott. That's probably
Travis, I know that this is probably not very important, but what you showed us from 89, that said it was a fee simple, if I'm saying it right, absolute for the property, and that would mean for the duration. So it would always be inheritable.
No, just to the next grantor. These are one time, each deed is a one-time thing.
Okay.
Fee simply means we're not restricting your ability to leave it as an inheritance. The next grantor gets to control that again for the next person. But once you put the non-fee label on it, that stays permanent to the property because that's a restriction.
Okay.
Okay.
Time and use, right? So there would be something there that you could or could not do.
That's exactly right. We don't really care if somebody doesn't restrict. We care if they do restrict. And so this is where we're going to wrap up for today. What do we call it when we transfer ownership and the grantor does not place any restrictions at all? That is called fee simple absolute, or sometimes just fee simple. Sometimes we leave the word absolute off, but fee simple absolute or just fee simple mean the same thing. That means a transfer, a deed, one document, one time in the history of this property. And on that one document, that grantor did not place any new restrictions against either the time of ownership or the use of the property by the grantee. Does it mean that the property itself doesn't have any restrictions against it, or does it simply mean that this grantor is not placing any restrictions? What do y'all think?
This grantor is not placing any restrictions.
It means that this grantor is not placing any restrictions. It doesn't mean that there are none, because a previous grantor could have placed them, but it means that this grantor on this deed has not placed any restrictions against the property, because every deed is different. And that's why you got to continually go back in time and look at all of them, because any ones that were placed are going to stay there forever. So because they are what? What's our favorite A word?
Appurtenant.
Appurtenant.
My favorite A word is asshole, but I guess we're talking about appurtenant. Okay.
Yeah, I guess so. So look at this question. I got this question and I got one example for you, and then we'll let you go for today. Samantha owned a property in 1910 and placed a restriction that no future owner could mine the property for coal. Bill owned the same land in 1950 and placed covenants that only homes of 8A. The next grantee will be able to mine coal because the restriction has not been updated. B, only the current owners are limited from mining coal, building something other than homes and limited fences. C, future owners can transfer the property fee simple absolute so long as they do not add further restriction. Or D, only the original developer can add restrictions in this manner. I love it. I love it. I love it. Here's what that tells me you're starting to get your brain wrapped around. That fee simple absolute doesn't mean there are no restrictions. Fee simple absolute simply means no what?
New.
No new restriction.
Current grantor.
Right? The current owner could transfer this property fee simple absolute, but the new owner still has to honor all those old restrictions. Is that okay for everybody?
Yeah.
Okay. So here's one last example. It says Alicia owns a farm in Albemarle, North Carolina, which she received from her deceased uncle almost 20 years ago. When her uncle transferred the property to Alicia, he placed a restriction on the property stating it could not be subdivided. Alicia sells the farm to Val, and Val must abide by the restrictions placed 20 years before, but Alicia adds no new restrictions. So how has Alicia transferred the property to Val? Even though it has restrictions that says it can't be subdivided, how has it been transferred from Alicia to Val on their deed?
Fee simple
Fee
absolute.
simple absolute.
Simple absolute. Fee simple absolute. Awesome. Awesome.
Good job.
That's a great, great job. And that's a great stopping point for us for today, folks.
Before everybody starts heading out,